After Spain handed over La Florida at the conclusion of the French and Indian War in 1763, the outgoing Spanish tide of people could not compare with what followed when the British moved in to claim their new territory. King George III's Privy Council in London issued orders encouraging white Protestant settlers from Britain and other North American colonies to settle the former Spanish lands. Parliament outlawed British migration to the western frontier of North America and substituted Florida as the new approved destination. Governor Grant in East Florida encouraged Carolina and Georgia planters to relocate to East Florida with the aim of replicating their plantation system based on slavery and cash export crops. John Moultrie of South Carolina responded by moving to East Florida with 180 of his slaves, as did several of his contemporaries. By 1772, British officials estimated that about 1,000 white British subjects and as many as 3,000 of their slaves had settled in British Florida. Meanwhile, the arriving tide of native tribes from the north continued to rise. Governor Grant started with 200 British soldiers to protect his new colony. He estimated that there were about 5,000 adult male native warriors in the interior. These Seminoles in progress occupied an immense territory that the British had to acknowledge by treaty. There, Native Americans continued to accept people escaping from slavery as neighbors and include them and their children into tribal communities. According to Patrick Riordan, Black Seminoles lived in native Seminole villages as well as in other villages by themselves, surrounded by fields of up to 20 acres. They dressed like the Seminoles, learned native languages, owned and used hunting rifles, and planted their fields in common as the native peoples did. Although some escaped slaves and their descendants had submissive relationships to Indians, in many cases they merely shared their harvests with a dominant village, such as tributary native villages also did with dominant neighbors. Many of these Black Seminoles were children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren of earlier runaways. We will never know what might have become of British efforts to replicate their other southern colonies in British Florida, though. Only a decade after the Treaty of Paris created British Florida, the American Revolution broke out in 1776. Suddenly, people in each colony had to take sides. As battles raged across the colonial landscape, many loyalists decided to pull up stakes and leave, in some cases taking slaves along with their other movable property. But these loyalist slave owners faced a dilemma. Back in Britain, the mother country had already outlawed human slavery in 1772 under the influence of the abolitionist movement there. Where could they go? Many of them decided that British Florida looked like their best bet. By 1781, fleeing loyalists were crowding into St. Augustine. The black population of the colony swelled to an estimated 10,000, many times greater than the additional 2,000 or so white British subjects who had relocated there. Loyalist refugees, however, just could not catch a break. As soon as they managed to flee to British Florida with whatever they could carry, the American revolutionaries triumphed over their colonial masters. The peace treaty signed in Paris in 1783 was a particularly bitter pill for loyalists who had fled to British Florida. The Spanish had secretly supplied the American rebels with weapons, ammunition, and other supplies almost as soon as the revolution broke out, so the Americans owed them a big debt and could not claim Florida along with the other British colonies. Instead, when diplomats from all these countries sat down at the table in Paris, King George had to sign over British Florida and everyone in it back to Spain after only 20 years of existence for his newest colonies. La Florida unexpectedly reappeared as a Spanish colonial territory on the maps of the world. This meant that now the British had to get out of town, just as the Spanish had evacuated 20 years earlier. Loyalist British planters who had moved to Florida with thousands of their slaves were really in a tight place. They couldn't go to England, where no slaves were allowed. Some went back to the newly independent southern colonies, said they were sorry, and hoped to set up their plantations there again. Others went to British colonies like Jamaica and Bermuda, where they could bring their slaves. Some sold all their worldly goods, including slaves, and took passage for places like Nova Scotia, the western frontiers of America, or beyond. Some, like the Scottish trading firm of Panton and Leslie, decided to stay in Florida and become subjects of the Spanish king in place of the British king. In the end, most of the recent Loyalist arrivals, along with most of the huge wave of slaves they'd brought with them, disappeared from North Florida as quickly as they had appeared, in many cases after only a handful of years of temporary residence. The main effect of the British Florida episode was not a larger population of European colonists, but instead a restoration of Native Americans to the region, along with expansion of the black Seminole population living among them. New Spanish governor Céspedes' top priority was attracting more people of European origins to an area that had been depopulated over and over again by Moore's destruction of the Appalachies in 1704, by the Spanish exodus in 1763, and finally by the British evacuation that was going on all around him when he arrived in 1783. He offered cash bonuses to settlers, large land grants, and no taxes for the first 10 years of residence. This didn't produce as much migration as he had hoped, so 3 years later he dropped the restriction on non-Catholic settlers and for the first time allowed slave owners to bring plantation slaves with them into Spanish territory. New Florida settlers in the Second Spanish period mainly concentrated along coastal rivers, leaving the interior regions pretty much undisturbed. Living side by side in the interior, relations between free black Maroons and the emerging Seminole nation grew deeper and stronger. Black Seminoles brought familiarity with the ways of the settlers, especially their language. They became valuable advisors and interpreters to Seminole tribal leaders. White settlement kept marching closer and closer, though, as enterprising planters and farmers from the United States moved into La Florida. The Seminoles raided these settlers, and black Seminoles in particular actively aided people to escape from slavery on the new plantations. American slave traders freely raided into Spanish territory, capturing and carrying off both black and native Seminoles to sell into slavery north of the border. The almost powerless Spanish government of the colony, for the most part, could only sit and watch. The border situation again reached crisis proportions by the early 1800s. During the War of 1812, British Royal Marines, not the Spanish, built a fort on the Apalachicola River to support Spanish Florida against the Americans. When the British left in 1815, they turned over what became known as the Negro Fort to black and native Seminoles living for miles up and down the river. Escaped slaves from all over the American South flocked to this refuge. Pressured by frustrated planters and their political allies, in 1816, troops of the 4th U.S. Infantry, led by General Clinch, invaded Spanish Florida. He attacked the fort for a week, but could not defeat the armed black defenders. Then gunboats of the U.S. Navy sailed up the river into Spanish territory and bombarded the fort, causing it to blow up and kill most of its defenders. But this did not resolve the problem of a large and growing population of natives, escaped slaves, and their descendants. In 1818, General Andrew Jackson sent a message to Washington, D.C. that he was starting from Fort Scott at the head of an army. His target was the troublesome native and black Seminole population in North Florida. Without waiting for orders from President Madison, Jackson marched through the same landscape where South Carolina Governor Moore had raided more than 100 years earlier. He attacked and burned native and black villages wherever he found them, from Lake Miccosukee all the way down to the old Spanish fort at St. Mark's. Then he drove the retreating Seminole nation before him all the way to the Suwannee River, but did not pursue them further into the Florida peninsula. His aim, like that of Moore before him, was simply to clear out people from North Florida that had been a nuisance to the American settlers near the southern U.S. border. While many of the black Seminoles retreated south into the Florida peninsula, along with the native warriors, some were captured and carried back into slavery in Georgia and Alabama by U.S. forces or by slave raiders from those states. The tide of people in North Florida ebbed once again, sweeping out the Seminoles just as it had the Appalachians a century earlier. Struggling with colonial rebellions of its own in Latin America and having little further use for La Florida, Spain eventually surrendered the territory to the United States in 1821 in exchange for recognition of Spanish sovereignty over Texas. In the new American Florida Territory, Andrew Jackson became military commissioner with all the powers of a governor except the title. Within a year, William Duval, a lawyer with French Huguenot ancestors, was appointed civilian governor by President Monroe. 2 years later, the territorial capital appeared in Tallahassee. The two most enduring boundaries in the region, the Apalachicola and Suwannee Rivers, conveniently divided the new Florida territory of the United States into three regions: West Florida, west of the Apalachicola; East Florida, east of the Suwannee; and Middle Florida, between the two rivers. We need to remember that Middle Florida means something quite different from Central Florida, as part of the peninsula farther south became known much later. The 1830 U.S. Census is the first comprehensive picture we have of the territory, since in 1820 it still belonged to Spain. All we can say for sure about the Florida Territory at its birth in 1821 is that it had more than the 5,000 residents set by Congress's 1787 Northwest Ordinance as the minimum needed to become a U.S. territory. Once the barrier of the former Spanish border disappeared in 1821, settlers from the southern United States, especially planters bringing their slaves with them, turned into a breathtaking flood of humanity unlike anything ever seen in North Florida before. Especially in Middle Florida, planters from other southern states quickly bought great tracts of virtually empty land perfect for plantations at a fraction of the cost of land back home. To the east of the Suwannee River, a weaker tide of arrivals mostly remained closer to the Atlantic shore. Along with planters and farmers moving to East Florida, a growing mercantile and trading population began to develop in Jacksonville to complement established St. Augustine. So by 1830, East Florida counted some 8,000 people, a little over half the size of Middle Florida. People in West Florida started the territorial period clustered mostly on the sandy soils around Pensacola, though many new plantations appeared just west of the Apalachicola River, and West Florida managed to count over 9,000 people in the 1830 census. Taken together, over 18,000 white inhabitants and over 16,000 of their black slaves lived in the territory by 1830. The entire territory counted only 844 free black residents, most of mixed race and living in cities like St. Augustine and Pensacola. Throughout the 1820s and 30s, though, new Florida plantations faced the same threat that had always faced plantations in Georgia and the Carolinas. Slaves continued to escape from plantations. Middle Florida planters now occupied the region that once offered refuge to runaway slaves, but that refuge simply shifted along with Native and Black Seminoles farther down the peninsula into remote, sparsely settled, and inhospitable areas. At least 1,000 Black Seminoles were said to be living among perhaps a couple of thousand native warriors and their families, armed and roaming the region where they had been confined by agreements with U.S. officials. Plantation slavery and free armed Black Seminoles clearly could not coexist. One of them would have to go. In fact, over the next few decades, both slavery and the Seminoles would largely vanish from Florida. But the Seminoles were the first to go, starting with the Second Seminole War in 1835, waged by the U.S. Army as well as Florida settlers and militia. Since that conflict took place mostly down in the Florida Peninsula, we won't rehearse all the tragic details of the forced removal of the Seminoles and their black allies. The Seminole Wars were just one small part of what has been called the Trail of Tears. All along the American frontier, more than 100,000 Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminole, and other native tribes were driven out of their ancient homelands and across the Mississippi in one of the most shameful episodes of U.S. history. The small bands of Seminoles who survived in swamps at the southern end of Florida no longer caused the settlers in North Florida much concern after that. Still, the planters could not rest easy even as the Black Seminoles were being driven out. After Nat Turner's slave revolt in Virginia in 1831, they suffered from a growing paranoia that their own slaves might rise against them and murder them in their beds. They lobbied for more restrictions and punishments against any threat to their human property. Middle Florida's numerical advantage put its wealthy planters in the political driver's seat in the territory. So in 1827, the Legislative Council adopted Florida's first slave code. They banned riot, rout, unlawful assembly, quarrel, or fight by free blacks and slaves. They prescribed the death penalty for a black person who committed a capital offense or burned a dwelling house, store, cotton gin, barn, or stable. In 1829, the council made it illegal to free any slave, banned free black persons from entering Florida, and ordered the free black population out of the territory. By 1832, they had banned interracial marriage and black ownership of guns. This piling on of more and more harsh laws protecting slavery created deep sectional discord in the territory. In January of 1838, the St. Augustine Florida Herald quoted one East Florida leader who remarked, "Perhaps it would suit all parties better to divide the territory at the Suwannee and let that part west of that river set up for herself, if she will." The new restrictions had gone beyond public consensus and were ignored or enforced inconsistently by many territory residents. Middle Florida planters, including Call, Parkhill, Chairs, Shepherd, Bradford, Braden, Benton, Willis, Hackley, Gamble, McCants, Epps, Bannerman, Croom, and others estimated that the territory had passed the benchmark for statehood of 50,000 inhabitants. So over the objections of East Florida leaders, they called a constitutional convention for the whole territory. The resulting constitution enshrined their protections for slavery and restrictions on both free and black residents. The referendum on the new document failed overwhelmingly in East Florida, but thanks to Middle Florida's larger population, it was adopted for the territory as a whole by 27 votes at the end of 1838. The tidal wave of Americans pouring into the Florida territory continued at a breakneck pace. The 1840 census confirmed that the population had climbed well over the 50,000 needed for statehood, though the territory would have to wait until 1845 for admission. Middle Florida and its slave plantations continued to dominate the territory, with as many people as East and West Florida combined. The planters had managed to solidify their economic interest for the time being. Over half of all slaves still lived in Middle Florida. The rest of the territory, in the peninsula to the south, still counted less than 2,000 settlers. In the decade after 1840, another 30,000 people appeared in the state, followed by more than 50,000 new Floridians during the 1850s, so the 1860 census found more than 140,000 people in the state, including over 17,000 living down in the peninsula, where many of them prospered raising cattle, but few owned any slaves. North Florida, on the other hand, showed the long-term success of the planter elite as slave populations of East and West Florida also grew rapidly in these early decades of statehood. Through the first half of the 1800s, Florida had gone from the Second Spanish period through its territorial stage to take its place as one of the slave states of the Old South. Throughout these decades, the peculiar institution of slavery dominated North Florida and radically transformed the region's population. Spanish residents had evacuated Florida twice, and British settlers had evacuated once. The Seminoles, both native and black, had repopulated the vacuum left behind by the destruction of the Appalachee, but in their turn were driven out and eventually transported out west, except for a handful of wily survivors. Slavery brought in a new tide of black as well as white residents, in the process swelling the population of Middle Florida in particular and marking its high water mark of political and economic influence. But the legal framework so anxiously constructed by slave owners was about to come to an abrupt end with the outbreak of the Civil War just a year after the 1860 census.